Yeah, and so 1830 this is representation of that. This is the state of the art that they had European varieties of cannabis that were well used in folk remedy, the seeds and the roots for arthritis. But as hemp seed was a very valuable farm commodity, the oil of it was used for paints and varnishes, but also was a base in many different pharmaceutical medicines.
Do we know the chemical content of the seed, or is that something you're waiting on?
No. It's clearly that in the 1830s, this would have been a CBD-rich European variety of hemp. It wouldn't have been a CBD diminished variety, you know, like bred for years to be less resinous. It would have been just CBD varieties, generally. So the oil that they would have made out of that would have been CBD oil, and a rich source of CBD for essential nutrients, and especially people suffering from CBD deficiencies or cannabinoid deficiency diseases like epilepsy. And you know, soon we'll recognize that these minor constituents that are only available from hemp are essential human nutrients. You know, some people are able to synthesize them for themselves without the provision of hemp, but other people can't do it, and they have chronic diseases as a result. So cannabis as an herb was used very much in the apothecary from the time of the Civil War into World War I. It was the third most used pharmaceutical product in the apothecaries, as physicians would make orders for how things were prepared, and the pharmacy on its own would make medicines and use this herb as a base. It was, you know, reliable and pretty much still at the time CBD. But around 1850, 1860, 1870, hashish grew in popularity, spawned by European magazines and by the stuff coming in on ships, and quickly the pharmacies of the time recognized the difference between the stuff coming out of Asia and the stuff coming out of Europe, or you know, the existing known varieties. And this was known to the botanist that Linnaeus named Cannabis sativa. It was the only thing he had seen. You know, and you know, it was one of his most important plants. By naming it sativa, he made that clear, and that's all he knew. And it was until 100 years later that they recognized the stuff that comes out of Asia was entirely different as a medicine, and so it was named Cannabis indica. So, what the bottles are telling me, my thesis of the case is that sativa here meant CBD, and indica here meant THC. And the problem was they didn't understand the importance of keeping their genetics straight. If the two quickly interbred, either purposefully or not, and we got a mock. But they tried very hard to keep CBD and THC apart. We have set after set after set that are sativa and indica, where you know that's been preserved. We feel that, you know, by the distribution of the ones that aren't in a set, that they were in sets. And really, 100 years ago, you know, the pharmaceutical catalogs and the medical literature of the time kept the difference between indica and sativa separate and had different indications for them. Indications that we believe match exactly what people were finding benefit from today. They got it 100 years ago, a lot better than we got it today. So it became very controversial, and we could tell this because of these inverted apothecary jars, which were a fad in the 1870s, where instead of having to look on a wooden shelf, all of a sudden we have the counter. And so you can put these on top of the counter, and so people could really look at them in a sanitary, clean way, almost magnified it. It was the high-tech display of its era and a sales tool, bar none. Now they weren't dispensing out of this thing, they would go get it from the back room, what you needed, but it was important for them to see, and people really wanted to understand the difference between indica and sativa, and this bottle was the way they did it. These bottles came really big, and they came really small, but both of them, you know, sativa indica. We have 4 sets that do this, 4 sets of inverted apothecaries now that do this. So, but as I said, they inevitably got hybridization between the THC varieties and the CBD varieties. And they didn't have the tools to tell the difference, and they didn't have, they were too scared of the thing, but you know, they didn't know about smoking and how it wasn't going to kill them and all those things. So it's not like they were going to go be doing this with their plants all day long to get what they wanted. But at the same time, they understood quickly that the wash between, the hybrid between THC varieties and CBD varieties produced yet a third medical principle. They didn't understand this was because CBD is the antagonist of the receptor and THC is the agonist. So, and then when you put the two together, you have a third medicine we're calling these days Sativex. And so Cannabis Americana was sold in the shelves of American drugstores into the 1830s, or until the 1930s, and became quite popular. We'll talk about that in a second. So, tinctures. The tinctures here is probably the best one to go to. And this shows the progression of jars of tinctures, starting with early tincture jars like this one, with a fly-down label, and then getting up to the sophistication of the poison tincture jar. And this was a recognition of the time that these medicines were powerful enough that an overdose of them could make people sick. It wasn't necessarily could kill them, but poisons were just enough to make you sick. Was be careful. And because of a series of stupid blunders on the part of apothecaries blown up in yellow journalism of the time, the profession needed to get professional. And so tighten up. And it's a fit of self-regulation. They came up with standards like the poison jar, where you put titillations on the jar to be able to tell, even in a dark basement or in a, you know, like back room, whatever, with no windows, electricity. At that time, they were pretty much operating in the dark, so you weren't going to make the mistake of dispensing out of a cannabis jar to something that shouldn't have cannabis in it by putting the titillations on it. This is a later standard in poison jars. These are really prized among jar collectors, to have the titillations and the poisons, and at times they wanted to have the skull and crossbones, and some jars do, and some have embossed in them poison. But the real standard was the fact that you needed to be able to pick them up and tell with your fingers that it was poison. And that was magnified. The same company came up with, like 15 years later, they came up with poison stopper, which is, there's no way you're going to be able to pick that thing up without knowing you were dealing with something that you had to be careful about. And the same here with the red label with the black type and all the red outline around it, all that became the pharmaceutical standards for poisons. And you know, so when we went from the herb to the tinctures is pretty much where the idea of it becoming something to, you know, adults only or whatever became known in March. In some states, like my dear state of Ohio, mandated the black type on the red label and those kinds of things. But mostly it was the industry is getting itself together, which is kind of, there's some lessons here for the industry, our industry here, you know, because we're kind of in the Wild West here.
Where did that be, the black and red?
That was just a trying to mark poisons apart from being something that could be drunk or, you know, used safely or whatever. Early government regulation,
It
but
wasn't prevented for underage people.
no, that's not at that point. They're not thinking of that at the time. I mean, no, actually, look at how many of these medicines have recommendations later on in the 1900s. Had recommendations and dosages for children. Okay, so here we are, at the end of the apothecary era, 1890s. What we document is how glass went from being hand-blown and extremely expensive, rare, first time people had seen it in impression, you know, in the sales tool of its time, to glass becoming molded in two-piece molds and three-piece molds, and then mechanical molds that were able to turn out bottles for pennies instead of, you know, precious bottles. And this changed the whole nature of the pharmaceutical industry. So we had the 1890s to the 1900s shift to where anybody with enough money to buy bottles and print labels could be in the pharmaceutical industry. But in the meantime, you had the apothecaries, the drugstores, the guys who were doing the dispensing of medicines, who stocked the sativa, the indica, and the Americana, and the seeds, and the extract. But they also, we actually have a set of 8, and this photo fell, so we don't have it up right now. But it has also the tincture, the syrup, and the elixir in the set of 8. And understand that if that's the drugs, this is about what we know about cannabis today. We got CBD medicines, we got THC medicines, we got soon to have Sativex someday in my lifetime, maybe Sativex, which is the combination of the agonist and the antagonist. We got hemp seeds for its medical uses and for its ability to save the planet. We have the extract of cannabis. And what you have to understand is the extract, and what they understood about the extract was decarboxylation. They understood that you could take a raw tincture of cannabis, using alcohol, keep it for a week, shaking it up every day, and then can out the alcohol and put it through a strainer, and what you'd have would be a tincture that would not get people high. It wasn't THC. It was the raw product called THCA. And in that form, it's not psychoactive, but it's a very powerful medicine that was used at the time. But they also understood that they took that same tincture and they boiled off the alcohol and they cooked it on the way and they had sugar in it as they boiled it, that they ended up decarboxylating. They didn't understand decarboxylating. They didn't understand they were cooking off oxygen from the product, but they understood that cooking it into a syrup or adding some herbs after that, making it an elixir. Everybody had their own little recipe. Between the syrup and the elixir, they were getting decarboxylated THC, active THC. So these would have been quite powerful psychoactively, where this one wouldn't have. And they got it, you know?
That's what else.
And so now we enter into the era of the patent medicine. They call, no reason why they're called patent medicine other than people were claiming patents that didn't exist. And they were claiming ingredients that didn't exist. And they were putting in ingredients that they didn't claim that caused addiction and all kinds of problems. And the era of patent medicines went very quickly before the government had to step in with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 that required them to put on the label what was in it. So these are 1890 to 1910 and 1906. And you can tell because they're not citing the Pure Food and Drug Act, and they're not meeting the label requirements of them. And very quickly after 1906, companies had to comply. That's what we have over here. We'll get to that. Well, maybe these two should get switched. But This is a good example of a medicine that fit the 1906 standard, done by my favorite company. I'm John, and these are, someday we'll understand if any of these other things work, but it contained 1/2 grain of cannabis, so of extract, and we're going to hopefully come down to numbers here with what it is, because so many of the bottles that we were able to collect have liquid contents in it, and the liquid contents have been now analyzed by 2 different phylogenetic labs and 2 different analytical labs, and studies that are taking place because of the ability of the museum to provide genetic material to these labs. Even 100 years later, preserved in the alcohol in these remedies is genetic material, is little pieces of cellular cells, of new cellular material that contains DNA that's maybe fragmented a little bit, but they're able to capture the fragments they need to be able to do the testing and be able to show us where in the tree of these things our medicines used to come from. And hopefully my theories about CBD and THC will be proven, but not really, because these things are so cleaned out. The pharmaceutical collectors that kept these things on the shelves were very, very careful to have the inside spotless, So, there was a real effort to keep these things off the shelves and out of sight. And every museum in America took cannabis out of their accessions and, threw them away. And somehow I get the feeling, after, if you'd understand it looking in my living room, that there are pharmaceutical collectors all over America with their prized collections of apothecaries, each and every one of them missing some key bottles that I have. So, smoking, okay, so anyhow, you're seeing aphrodisiac, this would actually kind of work today. You're not claiming a cure, you're not using Chinese stuff, you might even get away with, reproducing this product. I think it's pretty cool. I don't know if yohimbe's off the market. It's probably one of those banned herbs.
I think it's out there still.
Yeah. Get it at your health food store. So we've got Park Davis cans. The originals are over here. Cannabis smoking spread from the south to the north. It really started in New Orleans and that area, and spread north as the migrations after the Civil War up to World War II spread northward.
What about Mexico?
That too, yes, and up the west coast from Mexico. And to understand is that actually came out cheaper than tobacco. So if you wanted to smoke and you couldn't afford tobacco, this was a great alternative for you. And they sold a lot of it out of the drugstores in these little boxes that Park Davis, and now we've got 7 different companies documented, right? I've got 6 of them, and you have 7?
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah.
It'd just be about some would be in the boxes, the pressed flowers.
Well, I have to say that we took a few of my prized boxes apart when the phylogenetic guys were there, and the stuff is pretty well disintegrated and gone. But I just found a guy who's got it too, and he shook them for me on Skype, and he's got material in them, so he understands that I'm buying them to take apart, give the stuff away. So we got.
Can you just tell us what it says on the little blue box? Because that's like one of my favorite ones.
This one here?
The one right next to it, the circle.
The Earth contributes and J.L. Hopkins distributes.
The Earth contributes and J.L. Hopkins distributes. I love it.
So, and then this one you got to look at to get close to understand the modern companies that were making cannabis medicines in the 1930s before they were taken off the shelf. And I'm sorry, we got in the back the corn cures. This is a little passion collection here of mine, and I'm finding them on eBay. This is the one thing I'm still being able to buy on eBay.
Every once in a while.
Yeah,
They show up
and
randomly.
yeah, and so that it's fun. But you can see the bottom left is Johnson & Johnson's Corn Blaster. This is where Johnson & Johnson started with your making of cannabis foot products. And the bottom right, difficult for you to see, is better up, John. Just trying to explain how things got really modern in 1937 before they were taken off the shelf. Cannabis went through the transition that was difficult for many of the herbs and made it, to the point where we're making medicines that would fit on the shelf today unrecognized as being old. It's got the cardboard box, it's got the instructions, it's got the dosage, it's got the batch numbering and the labeling numbering and the dating and all the quality controls that modern medicine needs. And it was really a movement to get unpatented medicines out of the drugstore that caused cannabis and most all the other herbal medicines that we had to be taken away from our pharmacy. Any questions?
Did you tell everyone about the dog trials and Eli Lilly and Parker Davis?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the real problem with Americana, was once they moshed cannabis together in the 1870s, 1880s, they had the tools to take it back apart to create pure CBD varieties, pure THC varieties, except that in this push for standardization and in this the point where cannabis was losing its reputation as a reliable medicine because of the mix, because of the hybridization of the CBD and THC varieties, that Parker Davis and Eli Lilly at that time, fierce competitors, they were number one and number two in the botanical medicine market. They agreed to combine resources in a farm in northern Indiana and spend 9 years breeding Cannabis Americana that would be as quality as the Asian varieties.
A joint cannabis venture, if
Yeah.
you will.
Cannabis challenge.
Who were the players? Lily?
Eli Davis. One right there.
Bravo.
So let's see.